The day had been hot, the sun glaring down on the small town square where the wooden auction block stood in front of the general store. Dust swirled in the air as townsfolk gathered, their voices a murmur of gossip and anticipation. The girl stood there, shoulders slumped, wrists bound loosely in front of her, though she knew she could have broken free if she wished. But what would be the point? Where would she run to? She had no family worth trusting anymore, no money, and no home that welcomed her. Her name was Clara, though most people here never bothered to use it. They just called her that big girl. It wasn't meant as a compliment. She had been taller than most girls since she was 12, her frame sturdy and strong. Her hands were calloused from years of work in the fields, and her shoulders wide enough to carry sacks of grain that most men groaned beneath. But instead of being respected, she had always been mocked, ridiculed for being too big, too plain, too much. Now her own kin had decided to profit from her. Her uncle, a hard man with drink-red cheeks and cold eyes, had dragged her here that morning. "A mouth like yours costs too much to feed," he'd spat, shoving her forward. "Maybe someone will take you off my hands." Clara had stood in silence as he haggled with the auctioneer, too weary to fight back. Inside, her pride screamed, but her heart had grown heavy over the years. Every insult she'd ever heard now echoed inside her mind, and every pair of eyes staring at her today only confirmed the cruel chorus. Too big, too unwanted. The auctioneer tapped his cane on the wood. "Step up, girl." Clara climbed onto the block, her face flushed with shame as laughter rippled through the crowd. A man with a crooked hat chuckled to his friend. "Looks more like she should be plowing fields than wearing a dress." Another jeered. "Ain't no man wants a wife who could knock him flat." Each word struck like a stone. Clara kept her chin high, though inside she wanted to crumble. She scanned the faces, none showed kindness. Some smirked, others looked on with curiosity, and a few seemed disgusted, as if she were nothing more than livestock up for sale. "Who'll start the bidding?" The auctioneer called, though even he sounded half amused. "Strong back, big hands, should work like a mule," the man laughed. No one raised a hand. Clara's uncle barked, "Come on now, she ain't worth nothing." Someone give a fair price. Still, the crowd hesitated, enjoying the humiliation more than the prospect of owning her. Clara's throat tightened. She had told herself she wouldn't cry, but standing there, unwanted by even the cruelest bidder, made her feel lower than dirt dot and then silence. A figure at the back of the crowd had stepped forward. A tall man in a worn hat, boots scuffed from the trail, his face half shadowed by the brim. He didn't laugh, didn't smirk, he only looked at Clara, steady and quiet. His eyes, the color of the open plains after a storm, held no mockery. The auctioneer cleared his throat. "Well now, do we have a buyer?" The cowboy spoke, his voice deep and sure. "I'll take her." The laughter faltered, some men elbowing each other in disbelief. Clara's breath caught. Why would he? The cowboy reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch, setting it firmly on the auctioneer's stand. The coins clinked loud in the hushed square. "That enough?" he asked simply. The auctioneer blinked, then nodded quickly. "A fair price indeed." Before Clara could move, the cowboy stepped to the block and offered his hand. For a moment, she just stared at it, calloused, strong, yet gentle in the way it waited for hers. No one had ever reached out to her like that, not without mockery behind it. Slowly, with trembling fingers, Clara placed her hand in his. He guided her down the steps as if she were something precious, not a thing to be sold. The crowd murmured, a few men scoffing, others whispering. But Clara didn't hear them clearly. All she felt was the warmth of his hand, the steadiness in his touch. He didn't drag her, didn't shove her, he simply walked beside her, shielding her from the sneers around them. And in that moment, as the jeering voices faded behind her, Clara realized something she had never dared hope for. Maybe, just maybe, she was worth more than the world had ever told her. The clamor of the town faded behind them, replaced by the rhythmic clop of hooves on hard-packed earth. The cowboy had led her to a tall chestnut horse tied at the post, its reins swaying lightly in the breeze. Clara hesitated as he untied the animal, her heart hammering in her chest. She had been pulled out of one prison, her uncle's cruelty, and the town's scorn, only to find herself in the hands of a stranger. The cowboy adjusted the saddle without a word, his movements calm, deliberate. Clara finally found her voice, quiet but sharp. "Why did you buy me?" The question hung heavy in the air, sharper than she'd intended. He didn't look up. "Because you deserved better than what they were giving you." She frowned, unsure how to take that. Men didn't usually talk in riddles around her. They usually spat insults straight out. Still, his answer wasn't cruel. It was steady, like the rest of him. When he was done with the saddle, he turned to her and offered his hand again. She shook her head instinctively. "I can mount on my own." A ghost of a smile crossed his lips. "I reckon you can," but he kept his hand there, patient. And though she hated herself for the flicker of gratitude, she took it, letting him boost her onto the horse. The ride began in silence. Clara sat stiff in the saddle, every muscle taut, the rope burned still raw on her wrists. The town's jeers echoed in her head. Too big, too plain, too much. She half expected this cowboy, her new owner, as the crowd would call him, to throw the same words at her once they were far enough away, but he didn single quotes t-dot instead. He reached behind him, tugging off his worn leather jacket and handing it back. "Gets cold once we're past the ridge," he said simply. Clara blinked at the jacket. She wanted to refuse, to keep up her defenses. But the truth was, the late afternoon wind already nipped at her skin, and the jacket smelled faintly of leather, dust, and something warm like cedarwood. She pulled it around her shoulders, the sleeves hanging long past her hands. "You didn't answer me proper," she finally said, her voice steadier this time. "Why me? Why spend your coin on a woman no one else wanted?" For the first time, he looked straight at her. His eyes were gray-blue, sharp and clear, and when they met hers, she felt as if he could see right through all the walls she'd built around herself. His voice was low but certain. "Because you were worth saving." The words knocked the breath out of her. She stared ahead at the rolling fields stretching toward the horizon, trying to process them. Worth saving? No one had ever said such a thing to her. Her family had treated her like a burden. The townsfolk had treated her like a joke. And now here was this man speaking as if she mattered, but Clara wasn't foolish. Men always had reasons, hidden under kind words. She gripped the saddle horn, her knuckles white. "And what do you expect from me now that you've bought me?" Her voice cracked with defiance. No inside, fear churned. He didn't hesitate. "Nothing you don't want to give." Clara turned to stare at him, sure she'd misheard. But his face was calm, unreadable. He urged the horse into an easy trot, his posture relaxed, as if her question hadn't been sharp at all. The wind tugged at her hair as silence settled between them again. But it wasn't the same heavy silence from before. This one. It almost felt safe, though she didn't want to admit it. Hours passed as the sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the land in shades of gold and crimson. They crossed dry creeks, open prairies, and winding paths bordered by cottonwoods. Each time the horse stumbled on a rock or shifted beneath her, the cowboy reached out to steady her without a word. His hand firm but respectful. Clara found herself watching him from the corner of her eye. His profile was strong, his jawline shadowed with stubble. He didn't talk much, just rode with quiet assurance, like a man who didn't need to fill the air with chatter. That silence, strangely enough, felt gentler than the cruel laughter she'd grown used to. As dusk fell, a chill crept across the land. Clara shivered despite his jacket. The cowboy glanced at her, then nudged the horse closer to his own. "We'll stop soon," he said softly. "You'll rest tonight. No one will bother you out here." Clara's throat tightened. No one would bother her. She had never heard words like that before, not as a promise, not as a certainty. She wanted to believe him, but doubt clawed at her. Still, as the stars began to prick the darkening sky, Clara allowed herself one fragile thought. Maybe, just maybe, this cowboy wasn't like the others. Maybe his arms, steady and sure, weren't meant to bind her but to shield her dot, and though she didn't yet trust him fully, for the first time in years, Clara felt the faint stirrings of something dangerous and beautiful, hope. The morning after their long ride, Clara woke to the sound of roosters crowing and the faint smell of coffee drifting through the air. She sat up on the small cot in the corner of the cabin, blinking at the unfamiliar room. The walls were rough-hewn logs, the furniture simple and handmade. Everything about the place spoke of utility and endurance, not vanity. She rubbed her eyes, the memories of the day before crashing back into her mind, being sold, the humiliation, and then the cowboy's hand leading her away. She hadn't even asked his name. The door creaked open, and there he was, balancing a steaming tin cup in one hand. He didn't look surprised to see her awake. "Morning," he said, offering the cup. "Coffee?" Clara hesitated before taking it. The warmth seeped into her palms, and she realized how long it had been since someone had thought of her comfort. She murmured a thank you, her voice rough from sleep. "You can stay as long as you like," he said simply. "Work if you want, rest if you'd rather. No one's expecting anything from you." Her eyes narrowed. No one gave something for nothing, not in her world. "Why would you let me stay?" "You don't even know me," he shrugged, pulling up a chair. "Don't need to know everything about a person to see they deserve better than being sold like cattle." He glanced toward the window where the prairie stretched wide and open. "You're safe here." "That's enough for now." Safe. The word sat strangely on her tongue, as if it belonged to someone else's life. Later that morning, Clara stepped outside, drawn by the sound of horses whinnying. The ranch spread out before her, acres of pasture dotted with cattle, a sturdy barn, a small chicken coop. It wasn't grand, but it was alive with quiet purpose. The cowboy whose name she finally learned was Luke was already working, his sleeves rolled up, muscles flexing as he pitched hay into the trough. Without asking, Clara bent down to gather a fallen bucket. Her body knew work, it always had, and standing idle made her restless. She carried the bucket to the pump, filled it with water, and hauled it toward the barn. Luke watched her, his expression unreadable. "You don't have to," he said. "I want to," she replied quickly, almost defensively. "I'm not useless." For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then, slowly, Luke's mouth tugged into the faintest smile. "Didn't think you were." It startled her more than if he'd insulted her. She set the bucket down hard, cheeks flushing. She wasn't used to being seen not like this dot. As the days passed, Clara fell into a rhythm. She rose with the sun, gathering eggs from the coop, carrying water to the animals, helping mend fences. Her body ached, but it was the good kind of ache, the kind that came from work that mattered. And every time Luke glanced her way, not with mockery, but with respect, something inside her that had been brittle for so long began to soften. One afternoon, a storm rolled in. The wind howled across the prairie, rattling the shutters. The cattle grew restless, and Clara found herself shoulder to shoulder with Luke, driving them back toward shelter. Rain plastered her hair to her face, mud caked her boots, but she didn't falter. She hefted a feed sack nearly as big as she was, dragging it across the slick ground, while Luke steadied the gate against the wind. When the storm finally broke, leaving the air sharp with the scent of wet earth, Luke looked at her, his gray-blue eyes gleaming. "You're strong," he said simply, Clara braced for the second half of the sentence, the mocking twist she had always heard before. But it never came. He said it as if it was a fact, like stating the sky was wide or the grass was green. Not a flaw, not an insult. Just truth. For the first time, she didn't flinch from it. She straightened her back and let the words settle into her bones. That evening, as they sat on the porch sipping the last of the coffee, Clara dared to ask, "Why do you live out here alone?" Luke was quiet a long moment, staring out at the horizon where the sun bled into gold and crimson. Some folks talk too much. Some judge too quick. Out here, there's peace. He glanced at her, his gaze steady. Out here, you can be yourself without someone trying to cut you down for it. The words hit her harder than she expected. She wrapped her arms around herself, looking away so he wouldn't see the tears prickling her eyes. For Clara, the ranch was more than just land. It was the first place where her size wasn't something to be mocked, where her strength wasn't a curse. It was a place of quiet strength, just like the man who owned it. And though she told herself she would not grow attached, a small part of her began to hope she had finally found something she had never known before, a home. For weeks, Clara worked alongside Luke on the ranch, slowly shedding the weight of humiliation she had carried for so many years. Every day brought a new rhythm, mornings filled with the sounds of roosters and clanging buckets, afternoons beneath the endless sweep of prairie sky, evenings spent on the porch with cups of coffee cooling between them. She found a quiet contentment in the routine, but shadows don't disappear so easily. Word of her presence had reached town. Clara had hoped foolishly that once she left, people would forget about her. Yet gossip traveled fast. By the time Luke needed to ride into town for supplies, the whispers had already grown into cruel stories, that the cowboy had bought himself a workhorse that he must be desperate to take in. Someone like her. Clara didn't want to go, but Luke asked her to ride with him. "Best way to quiet talk is to show you're not hiding from it," he said gently. She'd argued, but in the end, she climbed onto the horse beside him, her stomach churning. When they reached the general store, the familiar sting of mocking eyes greeted her. A group of men lounged outside, their laughter sharp and ugly. "Well, if it ain't the big girl," one sneered, tipping his hat in mock courtesy. "Heard you got yourself a strong back to haul logs, Luke. Mighty practical of you." Another chimed in, his grin crooked. "Careful, she don't break the horse on the way home." Laughter followed. Coarse and cutting. Clara froze, her throat tightening. The words transported her back to the auction block, to years of whispered taunts and open ridicule. She felt the old shame surge, threatening to choke her. Her fists clenched at her sides, nails biting into her palms. She wanted to shrink, to vanish into the ground, but before she could move, Luke stepped forward. He stood tall, shoulders squared, his gaze like steel as it swept over the men. "That's enough," he said, his voice low but carrying the weight of thunder. The laughter died, unease flickering across the mockers' faces. Luke's jaw tightened. "She's worth more than every one of you put together." The words rang through the air, sharp and certain, leaving no room for doubt. The men shifted uncomfortably, muttering as they turned their eyes away. Clara stared at Luke, stunned. No one had ever defended her like that. No one had ever looked at her as though she had value beyond the work her hands could do. Inside the store, Clara busied herself with the shelves, her cheeks hot. Her heart pounded, not just from the sting of the insults, but from the way Luke had silenced them. He hadn't hesitated, hadn't faltered. He had simply stood beside her. When they stepped back outside, the group of men was gone. Clara climbed onto the horse without speaking, but her thoughts churned. She had lived her whole life believing she was something to be ashamed of. Even when she'd fought back, the words had always stuck. But now, someone else had stood against them. Someone had told the world she was worth more. On the ride back, silence stretched between them, heavier than usual. Clara finally broke it. "You didn't have to do that." Luke's gaze stayed fixed on the horizon. "Yes, I did." Her hands tightened on the reins. "But why?" His voice was quiet but firm. "Because they were wrong. And because you need to hear it as much as they do." Clara turned her face away, blinking hard. The tears came anyway, slipping down her cheeks before she could stop them. She wasn't used to kindness. She wasn't used to someone seeing her as more than her size. It terrified her almost as much as it warmed her. Back at the ranch, she slipped into the barn under the excuse of checking the horses. Alone, she pressed her forehead against the rough wood, her heart aching with confusion. She had spent so long believing she was unlovable that Luke's defense felt almost unbearable, but deep inside, beneath the fear and the scars of old wounds, a fragile seed had been planted. For the first time, Clara began to wonder if perhaps, just perhaps, she could be something more than what the world had always told her she was. Luke hadn't just silenced the shadows of the past that day. He had begun to light a path out of them. The weeks that followed tested both Clara and Luke in ways neither had expected. Life on the ranch was never easy, and autumn brought with it challenges that demanded grit, endurance, and trust. For Clara, it became a proving ground, not only to herself, but to the man who had given her a chance when no one else had. The first trial came in the form of a storm. A dark wall of clouds rolled over the prairie, swallowing the sunset in bruised shades of gray and purple. The wind howled, carrying with it the scent of rain and lightning. Clara and Luke rushed to secure the livestock, their voices carried away by the roar of thunder. Clara's body moved on instinct, her strength finally serving a purpose. She dragged heavy sacks of feed into the barn, closed shutters against the gusts, and fought alongside Luke to herd panicked cattle into safety. The rain came down in sheets, soaking her dress, plastering her hair to her face, but she didn't falter. When one of the gates threatened to break under the storm's force, Clara braced herself against it, her muscles straining, until Luke joined her and together they forced it shut. When the storm finally passed, leaving the land drenched and steaming, Clara sank onto a bale of hay, exhausted. Luke lowered himself beside her, their shoulders brushing. "You handled yourself better than most men would have," he said simply. The words should have embarrassed her. Instead, they made her chest swell with something fierce and proud. The second trial came days later, when a newborn calf was found weak and struggling in the field. Clara knelt beside the trembling creature, her large hands surprisingly gentle as she tried to coax it to feed. Luke crouched beside her, his steady presence guiding but never commanding. Together they stayed through the night, taking turns to keep the calf warmed out at dawn. When the calf finally stood on unsteady legs and bleated weakly, Clara laughed a sound she hadn't heard from her own lips in years. Luke turned toward her then, his face soft in the morning light, and said, "You think you're too much, Clara, but to me, you're just right." The word struck her harder than any insult ever had. She froze, staring at him, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted desperately to believe him. She wanted to lean into the warmth of his voice, the honesty in his eyes. But fear coiled tight in her stomach. "What if you're wrong?" she whispered. "What if everyone else has been right all along?" Luke's gaze didn't waver. "I know what I see." She turned away, blinking back tears. No one had ever said such things to her. No one had looked at her as though she wasn't broken or unwanted. The vulnerability of it was terrifying. The third trial wasn't nature, it was her own heart. One evening, she overheard whispers drifting from the fence line. A pair of townsfolk had come to trade, their voices carrying in the still air. "Poor Luke," one said with a sneer. "Stuck with that big thing out on his ranch. Can't imagine what he sees in her." Their laughter rang in Clara's ears long after they'd gone. Shame clawed at her chest, dragging her back to the auction block, to every cruel word she'd ever endured. She fled to the barn, pressing her fist to her eyes. When Luke found her, she tried to hide her trembling shoulders. "They're right," she said, her voice breaking. "You could have anyone. Why chain yourself to someone like me?" Luke stepped closer, his voice steady but fierce. "Clara, listen to me. Those voices don't matter. Not one bit. I didn't bring you here because I had no choice. I brought you here because I wanted to." She shook her head, afraid to believe. "What if I disappoint you?" He reached out then, his hand brushing her arm, grounding her. "The only way you could disappoint me is if you stop seeing yourself the way I see you." For a long moment, Clara stood frozen, torn between the wall she'd built and the longing in her heart. The trials of the ranch had proven her strength, but the trials of love demanded something harder. Trust died as she met his gaze, steady and unyielding. She realized the truth. It wasn't the storms, the cattle, or the cruel whispers she feared most. It was allowing herself to believe she could be loved. The morning sun spilled across the wide plains, painting the horizon gold. Clara awoke to the sound of birdsong outside the ranch house. For the first time in years, she hadn't risen with the weight of fear pressing on her chest. Instead, she stretched beneath the quilt and smiled at the smell of fresh coffee drifting from the kitchen. The ranch, once a stranger's place, had become her home. After her family had abandoned her, Clara thought she'd never know love or belonging again. But living on Jacob's ranch had shown her something different, something real. Every day she helped mend fences, fed the animals, and kept the hearth warm. The land was tough, demanding endless labor, but Clara found joy in its challenges. With each passing day, her laughter returned, her confidence grew, and the timid girl who once hung her head began to vanish. Jacob, true to his word, never treated her like a burden. He didn't flinch at her sighs, nor did he let the whispers of townsfolk affect him. When people stared too long, Jacob would wrap his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close with a steady pride that silenced every sneer. "You're just right," he always told her, words that echoed like music in her heart. One afternoon, Clara decided to bake a pie from the wild berries that grew near the creek. She wanted to surprise Jacob after a long day of wrangling cattle. The crust was a little uneven, and the filling bubbled over the edge, but when she presented it, Jacob smiled as if she'd served him a king's feast. He ate it with a grin, licking his fingers, declaring it the best he'd ever tasted. Clara's cheeks flushed, and she realized she wasn't afraid of her imperfections anymore. Jacob saw beauty where she once only saw flaws. As weeks turned to months, the seasons changed, and so did Clara. She began to notice how Jacob's tired eyes softened when he looked at her, how he lingered in conversation just to hear her laugh, how his hands brushed hers a little longer each time. Their bond grew stronger with unspoken understanding, built not on appearances but on shared kindness, resilience, and hope. But their journey wasn't without challenges. Clara's family attempted to return one day, drawn by whispers that Jacob's ranch was thriving. They came asking for money, spinning lies about wanting her back. For a moment, Clara's heart ached. Part of her still longed for their acceptance. Yet, when she saw Jacob step protectively in front of her, shielding her from their cruelty, she found the strength to speak. "No," Clara said firmly, her voice steady for the first time against them. "You sold me away as if I was nothing. But I've found a place where I am loved, where I am enough. I don't need your approval anymore." Her family left in stunned silence, never to return. And Clara felt free, like chains had been broken around her heart. That night, Jacob held her close by the fire and whispered, "I'm proud of you." She wept softly against his chest, knowing she had finally chosen her own worth. Soon after, Jacob asked her to be his wife. There was no grand speech, no crowd, just the two of them beneath the open sky, stars flickering like witnesses. He slipped a small silver band onto her finger, saying, "Not because I saved you, but because you saved me too." This ranch was just land until you filled it with life. Clara's tears fell, but they were tears of joy. She nodded, and in that moment, every scar, every cruel word from her past faded into insignificance. She had a man who cherished her, a home that welcomed her, and a future she could finally embrace. Their wedding was simple, but beautiful. The local pastor blessed their union under the big oak tree near the ranch. A few neighbors attended, smiling warmly, and though Clara wore no jewels, she glowed brighter than the morning sun. Jacob looked at her as if she were the only woman in the world. As they danced in the grass that night, fireflies glowing around them. Clara leaned into his embrace, her head resting against his chest. She realized the truth love wasn't about fitting into someone else's expectations. It wasn't about size, perfection, or pleasing others. Love was about finding the arms where you truly belonged, and in Jacob's arms she had found her forever home.